Um, Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's event, Tamizdat Artist Mobility Session, US and Canadian Artists Visas 101 and Update. I'm Krista Bradley, the Director of Programs and Resources at APAP. I use she, her pronouns. I am a brown-skinned Black woman with curly dark black hair, and I'm wearing blue glasses and a blue V-neck shirt in my office. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that APAP is located in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway, Anacostan, and Pamunkey peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present. Closed captioning will appear automatically on your screen. If you would like to disable the chat transcript, please click More on the bottom of the Zoom window and hide subtitle. We are also joined today by ASL interpreters from Purple, Laura Hamby and Mary Moylan. Thank you so much for your service today. At APAP, we offer opportunities for year-round networking. We have a series of webinars to provide you with the tools you need as an arts professional in the field. Our upcoming events, you can see on your screen. On June 26th, we will be highlighting the Arts Compensation Project, a program that we are launching to gauge the compensation and salary data of working professionals in presenting organizations in the US and Canada. We hope that you might join us for that. And on June 28th, we'll have our final Tamizdat Artist Mobility session in this series, US and Canadian Artist Taxes, on the 28th from 3 to 4:15. For more information on our upcoming programming, visit apap365.org/programs. And now it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our panel and really underscore our appreciation for our partnership with Tamizdat. The Association of Performing Arts Professionals, as you know, is the National Arts Service and Advocacy and Membership Organization for the live performing arts field. And we're dedicated to developing and supporting a robust performing arts, presenting, booking, and touring industry and the professionals who work within it. We get to partner with Tamizdat, who is an amazing organization, nonprofit organization that facilitates and advocates for international cultural mobility and exchange. This session is part of a series of out of a partnership that we've built which is built on the work of both of our organizations and as part of our cultural advocacy group's Performing Arts Visa Working Group, both facilitated and supported by the League of American Orchestras. And so now I want to turn it over to Matthew Covey, who's the Executive Director of Tamizdat. Matthew.
Thanks so much, Krista, and thanks to APAP for giving us a chance to do this. Exciting to be able to bring these sessions to an audience, sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. And to those of you who have come today, I want to introduce Danielle and Mercedes to start with. But first, my name is Matthew Covey. I'm the Executive Director of Tamizdat. As Krista said, it's a Brooklyn-based nonprofit. We do legal research, advocacy, and education in the field of our international artist mobility. Specifically, I spend most of my time fighting with the U.S. government to get them to let artists into the U.S. to tour. I'm a middle-aged white man with short brown hair, a beard, and glasses. And I just realized that I think I'm wearing exactly the same blue collared shirt now that is in the bio picture that is being projected as well. I'm a little embarrassed by that because I do have more than one shirt. We are joined by Danielle Devlin, who's an artist agent and manager through her own Canis Major music agency. She's an expert on both Canadian and US touring. She brings to her work a passion and commitment that has made her a leading figure in North American music scene, in Celtic, global roots, and jazz, as well as numerous other genres. Mercedes is the co-artistic director of London, Canada's Sunfest, but more than that, she's an enormously experienced cultural promoter working in both nonprofit and corporate sectors. Whose passion for music, languages, and culture are evident in everything that she does. Amongst her many hats, she is on APAP's board and a member of Folk Alliance's Culture Equity Council. So that's us. I want to start. I want to start by just sort of framing the question and framing the topic related to the issues having to do with cross-border visas for artists. Primarily, we're thinking about artists from the US who are touring in Canada and artists in Canada who are touring in the US, but we can go farther afield from that if we wish to. I want to encourage everybody, especially because it's a small group, I want to encourage everybody to feel free to ask questions as we go along. Throw them in the chat, raise your hand, just shout out, whatever you feel like doing in order to make sure that we answer questions as we move along, because these are complex topics. And if you wait until the end to ask your questions, chances are the context will be lost and it'll be confusing at that point. So we're better off hitting the questions as we go along. Also, again, because it's a small group, please feel free to raise issues or direct the conversation into specific areas that you're concerned with. We were talking a little bit beforehand, and while the issue of the issues that we struggle with may be obvious, I think that, you know, Danielle, you were making some comments before we even started about the interconnection of the problems that Canadian and US artists face, as well as presenters on both sides of the border. So in your work, booking tours that cross the border, what do you see as being how do you see the visa issues that happen on both sides? Obviously, the US side is significantly harder to overcome than the Canadian side, but what kind of interrelationship do you see? Do you see for example, the issues in the US affecting Canadian presenters?
Sure. I'll just start with a visual description of myself. For those that are present, my name is Danielle Devlin. Again, as Matthew said, I'm working with Canis Major Music, and I have short brownish hair, glasses, and I'm wearing, I should look at the frame. I'm wearing a navy blue, bright blue, and black and white dress. And I'm here online with you from Vermont, traditional home of the Abenaki in the Missisquoi Valley. So one of the issues that I hear of and sort of participate in regularly is the difficulty with matching up the needs of what Canadian presenters are sort of facing with their contract needs and in planning their seasons and festivals, and how that intersects with US presenters who kind of sometimes are the keystone for those tours happening across North America. You know, for Canadian presenters, it can be so much easier to bring an international touring artist, whether that's from the US or from outside of North America, because the visa process is much simpler and the taxation is as well. So the budgets aren't as much of a concern as it is by compared to the US. And because of that, Canadian presenters are oftentimes sort of left hanging to wait until those US tours are confirmed and the visa is in place and in hand before they can actually contract with these artists. And I hear that a lot from other presenters, as well as that's something that I'm facing in negotiating my own contracts with Canadian presenters. Like, really, the US can sometimes be a keystone in making that Canadian tour happen if they are touring in both countries.
Thank you. Mercedes, do you see the same thing?
I see similar things. Sorry, first of all, I'll start with an introduction of myself. I'm Mercedes Bishop, based in London, Ontario, Canada, and which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Huron-Wendat peoples. I am well, medium skin, brown skinned woman with long black hair, curly hair. I'm wearing hoop earrings, and I'm wearing a white t-shirt and a yellow cardigan on top. So just to continue what Danielle was saying, I would say that that is definitely an issue. And if I would also say too that while that the visa process and the taxation process might be simpler in Canada, it takes a lot longer, especially now post-pandemic. That's one of the bigger issues that we're facing, is that I believe the Passport Agency Canada is essentially struggling with about 1 million cases, and they're behind on that situation. So it's actually takes a long time, whereas before it would take 30 days approximately to process a visa. It could take maybe up to a year sometimes now, depending on what country they're coming from, several months to a year. And then we don't even know if they'll be A, approved, B, for how long. So we're not entirely sure as to how long they will have that visa. So as to say that, okay, well, if the visa doesn't work out for this year, maybe we can bring them next year. That might not be the case, because they may just approve a visa for even 30 days, as little as 30 days. Typically what we've seen is about 6 months, but it can be a lot shorter than that. So that means that they would have to then apply again. Another issue that I find with Canada, if they're coming specifically for that, because now with the visa costs rising in the US, you see a lot of bands that want to start in Canada and just kind of open the door to North America with Canada because it's a lot cheaper. But given the distances that we have between our cities and festivals and venues, you know, sometimes the tour might not be worth it enough, essentially, in terms of a good investment for acts to come. So a lot of the time when presenters such as myself, we want to advocate for an artist to come, we end up acting like booking agents, because we really do have to round up other presenters and venues in order to create that tour, so that they can first pay for the visa process in general, and to have everybody on board enough so that there's the timing, so that we can know that they're going to have the visas. Because some festivals, depending, they want to make sure the visas are in place before they even announce the lineup. Whereas others, such as myself, we take a little bit of a risk and hope for the best that they'll be coming through.
That's really interesting. And thank you for that, Mercedes, because it brings up something that I've seen a lot of around the time of the big showcase events in the US, is people doing paid tours through Canada and then dropping down into the US to do a showcase as a way of getting some money while they're in North America, but avoiding the US visa process. And I think what I want to mention there, and this is sort of goes into the pedantic part of this session, I want to talk just a little bit about showcasing in the US, because I think that's something that there's a lot of confusion about. And there has been a lot of changes in policy over the years. So I think it's really important for people to understand that there is in practice, there is a carve out in the US law that allows performers to perform at an industry showcasing event if that event is recognized and is a major event. The problem is there's no real law around it. There's just practices that are generally accepted. So if an artist is coming to the US to perform in an event where the principal purpose that the audience is there is to think about working with them, to think about hiring them in the future, then chances are pretty good they can do that performance without going through the expensive process of getting an employment-based visa, a P or an O visa. So when an artist is coming to perform at South by Southwest or at the APAP conference, if they're in the conference center, or at Folk Alliance, those events, at least in theory, can be done by an artist who's just coming into the US, either on a visitor visa, a B1 or a B2, or on ESTA, if they're coming from an ESTA country. The reason I'm a little cautious about it is that whether someone's allowed into the US or not always comes down to the decision of the passport control officer. And if the passport control officer doesn't believe that the artist is in fact coming to do a showcase event, if they think that they're touring and doing professional gigs, they might be turned away. And that's something that worries me every time somebody says, yeah, I'm going to be doing, these 5 paid gigs in my van driving across Canada, and then I'm going to drop down and do Folk Alliance in Kansas City. It worries me because everything about the van, when it crosses the border, looks like a band on tour. And I worry that there's an officer out there who reasonably might look at that situation and be like, I think you're trying to get away with something. So that's something I lose sleep about. There's a lot more to that topic, but I don't want to go into it too deeply unless people have questions about it. So is that something that those of you who are in attendance here, is the notion of showcasing something that you have questions about? If not, we can move on.
Oh,
that's really interesting.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I mean, the thing that I've always taken as the real question is, are tickets being charged to an audience? Is that not sort of the final, like if an officer then they're like, I think you're trying to get away with something, and the band can say, look, there are no public tickets to this event.
You would think so, but unfortunately, the one event that we know of that falls squarely within the showcase exception, because the government has said so, is South by Southwest, and they're charging $1,500 for a pass to go to the event.
Mm.
So they're not charging tickets for individual shows, but they are charging a pass to the entire event, which isn't that different than Coachella, which we know they can't do without a visa. So, I think, Taylor, I think that that's a really good question. What I think is maybe a better way to look at it is when you go to the website. Well, there's two things that I think that the issue turns on. One, if an officer Googles the website, does it appear to be a public facing event, or does it appear to be an industry facing event? That's going to be part of what goes into that decision. But more importantly than that, if you are bringing artists to play at a showcasing event, do you have a really watertight invitation from that showcasing event that explains why it's a showcasing event, gives the legal rationale, ideally cites the case from the 60s that created this precedent, and all that kind of stuff? If that's there, the chances of that artist being able to come across the border without a problem are much higher.
Thank you.
Sure. That's a really good question, though. Does anybody else have any other questions on that topic? I have a question for you two, for Danielle and Mercedes. Is there any specific, are there specific rules, like at what point does it get more complex when you're going to Canada? I mean, when Elton John is coming with an entourage of 70 people and they're making millions and millions of dollars, is that a different visa classification? Or are they under exactly the same thing as just like the indie band that's popping over from Duluth?
That's a great question. I don't know if I don't have a confirmed answer for that, but I have a feeling for that.
Okay.
I would say that given name recognition, such as somebody like Elton John or Paul McCartney or whomever, I would say that there's a priority given there, and that's essentially, and ultimately they're coming from the US and the UK, and so they actually don't need visas, so there's no issues there whatsoever.
Okay.
So it's really, you're looking at the global majority countries from which they're coming, so anywhere from Central South America, Africa, Asia. That's where you're really going to be running into problems. And especially what we've been seeing in South America is it has been quite delayed in terms of receiving any kind of responses. Even recently, I was working with the International Indigenous Music Summit, and we had a band coming from Panama to showcase, not to perform a paid event, but to showcase specifically. And that's a difference between the US and Canada, is that anyone who's not coming from the US or Europe, they do need a visa regardless if it's showcasing or performance. And so anyway, so this band was coming from Panama and they applied for visas. We did not hear back in time whether or not they were coming. There happened to be one of the dancers that was coming anyway to Canada to study English. So she was able to make it and perform 2 videos. We made it a bit of a hybrid thing. But we got notification during the actual summit that they got denied their visas. And yet, 2 days ago, the government of Canada said that Panamanians no longer need visas to come to Canada. So it's kind of a weird, like if they knew this was coming down the pipeline, why put them through this process?
Right, sure.
Why not say, hey, wait until this date because it's coming? Because this is not something they decide from one day to the next.
Right.
And so those are the hardships that we still face. It's a systemic problem. This is discrimination and racism that happens within the system itself. People thinking that people are coming to Canada because they want to stay. And so ultimately, these are things that we're still facing, especially like for myself, we're coming as presenters that present global music. And so in the end, we do end up all of our international lineup, about half of them need a visa, and we're actually still waiting on quite a few of them, and our event is in less than a month. So
Wow.
We do have miracles pulled off that they get their visa a day or two before. Last year, for example, just to give you an example of 2 priorities, we had a band from Ukraine coming, and of course our members of parliament were on it because they wanted to make sure, because of the conflict that was happening in the relationships between Canada and Ukraine, that those were prioritized as well. So there's definitely a skip the line process, I would say, in terms of what happens with the visa process in Canada.
That's really fascinating. And it's kind of flipped from how things work in the US. I mean, yes, it's similar in the sense that there is profiling and racism that's driving a lot of the problems, but also on a different level, a major production, like I was asking about, is asking for a huge amount of trouble, because it's not that Elton John's going to have a problem, but you're going to have so many problems with, if you've got an entourage of 70 people, there's going to be, 35 of those are going to be issues in some way or another. Krista put a question here to me, which is in regarding showcasing at an event, like say, for example, the APAP conference, is there a difference between an artist performing at the Hilton in the conference halls or performing at industry events around town? Yeah, I really would say there is. I think there's a significant difference. I think playing at the event, you're paying only for people who have badges and are part of the industry. And those are clearly showcased where you do not need to have an employment-based visa. Whereas if you're playing any of the commercial showcases, a Global Fest, the Electric Cowbell, Barbest Showcase, any of those showcases, those are situations where the public is absolutely coming and buying tickets to see those shows. And we've always taken the position that an artist who's performing at one of those events really does need to have an employment-based visa. In a way, it kind of makes sense, because if an artist is playing at those events, they're already being teed up for touring in the US. Presumably they're performing at those showcases because they're either signed to an agent or about to sign to an agent. So it kind of makes sense to make sure that if the showcase goes well, then they're ready to roll and they've got the visa in place. But of course, that depending on the calendar, that may not be the case. But yeah, to your question, Krista, I would definitely make a major distinction between stuff that happens in the Hilton and stuff that doesn't. Going back to you guys, I have one more question about when you do and don't need a visa in Canada. What about recording? Is there any reason why, if an artist is coming to record under contract to a Canadian label, do they need a visa? Is that working? Is that different than performing? Do you know? I don't think you have.
I don't know, unfortunately. I think maybe Danielle, you might have an answer for that.
Sorry, I totally sprung that on you. You didn't know I was going to come up with that.
And you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. I was actually just about to chat Matthew to ask a clarifying question. Can you actually, because my mind truthfully was distracted as I was like, oh, we need to clarify something. Can you just repeat the question?
Sure. I'm so sorry. I totally sprung this on you because this was not in our prior conversations. If an artist is, and I bring this up, the question is whether the kind of open door of Canada for performing extends to the recording situation. I ask this because there's a really weird little carve out under US law that if an artist is coming to the US to record pursuant to a contract with a non-US entity, they don't need a work visa to do that. They can do that as a visitor, tourist, whatever. But if they're coming to record in the US pursuant to a contract with a US entity, a US label, publishing company, whatever it might be, then they do actually have to have an employment-based visa because they're coming to work for an American. And I'm just wondering if there's anything, if you know, first of all, it's okay if you don't know, because this is not live music and I'm totally didn't warn you I was going to ask you this, but
it's related.
I'm just wondering, it is related-ish. I'm just wondering.
And I have some experiential.
So,
yeah.
What's
so
the situation in Canada when it comes to recording?
Yeah. So, and actually this leads to one of the other questions that I was going to ask you to clarify. So, if an artist is coming, they have their entry visa. That's one of the things I kind of wanted to sort of start with is that, we use the term visa sort of across North America, but it does mean different things.
Right.
In the US, there's the term visa for the actual petition. That's more of a work permit. And then there's the visa, which is used for entry through their passport. So in Canada, for live performance, outside of, television, radio, broadcast, and film, you generally don't need a work permit. And that would include for recording as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're working with a band, recording with either other Canadians or on your own and you're in studio, if it's not something being recorded for film, television, or radio, but you're recording for, an album, that's permitted. But you would still need an entry visa if you qualified for needing that entry visa, which, as Mercedes outlined, that would be, sort of the the majority countries that are requiring that.
Right. But what's interesting about that is that in the US, if you do need if in most of the situations where employment authorization is required, you'd have to get that taken care of before they would even consider you for the visa itself.
Yes.
Whereas it sounds like they're sort of processed separately in Canada.
Yeah, for most live performance, they're not going to need that work permit.
Okay, cool.
They're going to need that entry visa.
Okay. Before we move on to other topics, people watching from home, do you have any questions about what we've been talking about so far? Is that making sense? I'm looking to see if anything comes up in the chat. I'm interested in either one of you, because I feel like something has been revealed here that I didn't know, which is that there's significant problems for a lot of artists from around the world getting into Canada. And Mercedes, you were saying that there's very significant delays. What kinds of who do you turn to? What are the resources that are available to Canadian presenters or agents or labels who are hitting a wall with immigration in Canada? Are there resources available?
Well, I mean, if you're an artist yourself, you can go through an artist union. Typically, they do have a way of pushing through a little bit the visa process. But in terms of presenters, we've been very, very lucky to get to know our members of parliament, and the ones that are in our area of where we work, where our office is based. So we've been very fortunate ourselves to get to know them and pass them along once the bands themselves apply to the visa, to send them all of the information, passport numbers, identity numbers, date of birth, and visa file number and names, of course, to the members of parliament. And they push that information as a priority, just because we are an event that is of significance in our region. And so unfortunately, others are not that lucky. Either A, they don't have a relationship with their member of parliament, or they're just starting out, in which case you still have to go through that line. You have to go visit them and knock on the doors of those who have some power, especially in within the government. And so that is usually the route that we take. Otherwise, you can go to any live music associations. For example, in Canada, there's a Canadian Live Music Association that has direct contact to members of parliament or ministers themselves, that can actually push through, especially depending on the project. But ultimately, it just comes down to time. The presenters really do need to push the artists and agents to apply early for the visa. So because a lot of time we can't do anything ourselves until they apply themselves. So when they apply, then we can come in and actually do that work to push that through, which takes a process within itself. But until they actually get together, figure out who it is that's going to be touring, the band members, because sometimes that changes if they're bringing anybody with them, and then gathering all of that information and then actually filing the application itself. So that's the hardest process, because it can be very confusing for anyone who has never done it. So many people think that you have to get a temporary work permit, which is not the case. It's actually a tourist visa that you're doing. And so at that case, that's where it gets confusing as to which one do I apply to, which one do I do this. And so I think we were talking just before this started, any kind of consultancy, anybody who's been an expert in doing that can actually build a business on that, because it's we do refer, we've built a little bit of a network depending on the countries with which we're working, of saying, hey, this agent has done this successfully, it'd be good to turn to them and consult with them and see what they did in order to really fill everything out properly. And of course, language itself is the barrier. So not a lot of these forms come in Spanish or Mandarin or anything like that. It comes in English and French, and so language itself can be a very big barrier for people to fill them out. So essentially, yes, those are the two things that we have, is essentially making sure we're being organized, but two, pushing through with the members of parliament in order to expedite that process, and making them aware of the importance of the art that you're bringing to the country. So for example, this year, for the first time, we're bringing a Colombian band from the Afro-Pacific region of Colombia. It's never really come to Canada. And so therefore, that's something of significance to bring some new culture through there. So working with the embassy and then working with the members of parliament in order to expedite that. We're bringing a band from Belize that they apply for their visas in Guatemala. And in Guatemala, we had a contact. And so we had to make sure to reach out to that contact and ask them for a letter of support. So it is a lot of, who is it that who do you know at the embassies,
Right.
who do you know within government, in order to really expedite that process as much as possible.
That's really fascinating. It's funny because it kind of reminds me, things got a lot worse in the US during the Obama administration. And part of the reason was because they reached out to the arts sector for guidance. And one of the things the arts sector complained about was the inconsistency of the process, partly because it was all so much this is going back more than 10 years ago. So much of the process was about who you knew and who you could cajole into trying to make something happen. And that led to the inconsistency. So in an effort to try to make the process more consistent, they started rooting out the ways that people were pulling strings, and it just made everything difficult for everyone. So they ruined it for everybody.
I think regardless, any system is made of pulling strings and who you know. I think it's just is really knocking on as many doors as possible just to be heard and making noise in order to make it an issue that's worth advocating for.
True, absolutely. I want to touch on two things because we're sort of talking about, when we're talking about showcasing and recording, we're talking about the situations where at least in the US, you don't need an employment visa. I want to mention two other ones, which I think are really material for an APAP audience. One is a situation where an artist is coming to the US to perform at a university or other institution of higher education. There's a super narrow, weird, complex rule that allows international artists to do that kind of performance without getting an employment visa, either on ESTA or on a visitor's visa. It's really complex. And as I said at the beginning, one of the things that Tamizdat does is provide pro bono legal assistance to people in the arts. If you have an artist who's coming to the US and they're principally performing at educational institutions, reach out to us, ask us, because we can work with you to do the analysis of whether maybe they don't need a visa, which would be amazing. You save a ton of money. The other situation that comes up that's important for people in the APAP world to know is that there's an exception for events that are being sponsored and paid for by an artist's home country and where the audience is not paying to see the event. And those people also don't need to have an employment-based visa. So for example, a week from Saturday, there's the Central Park Summer Stage Aussie barbecue, where there's a jillion Australian bands all come trooping to town, and there's a big Australian day. Many of those artists don't have employment-based visas because it's paid for by the Australian government and it's free to the public. And that's a wide open door for not having to get a visa. Of course, if they play another gig downtown that night, all bets are off and they're going to have to get that visa. But it's an important exception that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it can really help an artist. So for example, they can do that whole tour of Canada where they get paid, and then they come and do a showcasing event, and then they do an embassy event, and then they do a college event, and they're done, right? And they've gotten some plays, and they've even made some money in the US, and they've made money in Canada, and that's a tour without having to dive into the whole muck of getting O&P visas. Taylor, you got a question?
That is incredible information to know. Thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm curious because I have never heard that about a university or educational facility. Because so many of those university performing arts centers are public facing and they're selling tickets.
Right. So that's part of the tricky thing that's why I said it's a very narrow exception. And the description that you get from the government is not particularly useful. And so what we would recommend, basically, the description makes it clear that if the artist is coming to perform as part of the academic program, whatever that means, they need to have that visa. There's limits to it, a certain number of dates over a certain number of months at a certain number of institutions. So there's limits on how much that can be done. The way that we would recommend handling that, which is the same with the showcase event, which is the same as recording, which is the same as a cultural event for an embassy, is we would recommend don't do it on ESTA. Because if you're doing it on ESTA, what you're doing is you're asking that artist to show up at passport control with all their instruments and hope the officer understands the nuances of these little exceptions. What we would say is, if you're bringing an artist to do a performance or a series of performances at academic institutions, have them get a B1 visa. If they're eligible for ESTA, don't go on ESTA anyway. Have them get a B1 visa at a US embassy where they go and provide the invitation letter from the university. And that way, when they get the visa issued, that B1 visa issued, and then oftentimes the embassy will actually write for performance at Princeton University. Great. And then you've got it written in the passport. But either way, when you arrive, if an artist is arriving with an invitation from an educational institution and they have a proper visa in their passport, the Customs and Border Protection officer at the airport is going to look at that and be like, I don't know what you're doing. Normally, I would doubt what you're saying. I would think you're trying to sneak in and gig. But the embassy in Oslo or Santiago or wherever it might be has already looked at this, and I'm not going to challenge their decision, and they're going to let you in. I've never seen a situation where somebody came to the US, could have come on ESTA, decided to come on a B1, made the argument for one of these exceptions, and had if they had that proper visa in their passport where they had a problem. So Taylor, what I would say is, if you want to use one of these exceptions, first of all, make sure that the context of the performance or performances fall squarely within the exceptions. Then have the artist go through the hassle, not very much, $190, not a big deal, of getting the visa issued. And then if that visa is issued by the embassy, they're probably not going to have a problem. One thing I want to say to that, though, is getting visa issued at the embassy historically isn't very hard, but right now at a lot of US embassies around the world, it's a big problem because of short staffing at the US State Department. So sometimes this works better than others. So if you're considering doing one of these exception approaches, again, that's another great situation to reach out to us and say, what are you hearing about getting a B1 interview in Paris, for example? And we can tell you what we're seeing in terms of a delay.
And is something that embassy is going, so if an artist goes and they have this letter of invitation from the university, is there an expectation that the university is not charging for tickets and not opening this to the public?
It's not clear. We have not seen, if the invitation says this is part of our normal academic functions and tracks the wording of the statute, I don't think I've ever seen an embassy deny a B1 visa based on that. You just have to say, this is what the regulation is, this is what we're doing. I have never seen an embassy do due diligence to look into it and say like, oh, that's sort of too much public facing for our taste. Like that analysis doesn't seem to happen. It could theoretically, but I've never seen it happen.
Wow. All right. Thank you.
Sure. But Taylor, come back. If you're looking at using that, come back to me, because there are a lot of specifics to how that works. And I'd want to make sure that you're clear on all the limitations on that exception.
Of course. Thank you.
Sure. Whenever I say something like that, it's like, oh wait, but I've let this thing out into the world, and dear God knows what'll happen next. We're at the 45-minute mark, so I want to move on to a couple topics. Mercedes and Jenny have talked a little bit about the issues related to bringing artists from global majority countries into our respective countries. Certainly, we talked about Canada. I would say for the US, things have gotten a little bit better with the current administration, except that there's still so many delays at US embassies. We have found, like you were saying, Mercedes, that congressional help is really very useful if things get stuck these days. One thing I wanted to talk about is First Nation artists, and when they're traveling across the border, because the US has a weird rule or sort of rule that allows Canadian First Nation artists to enter the US to perform without the work authorization that every other Canadian would have. It's not actually law, but it seems like it's consistent practice at the border. Is there a rule that goes the other direction? Do you have any idea? I guess
So we
it
did
doesn't matter
have,
because you don't have a visa, so it works for everyone.
yeah, no, they just have to be, you just have to make sure that they're not getting, for showcasing, it's fine. They can, but there needs to be a clear letter of invitation written by the presenter that they're coming to do that specifically. We actually just had to deal with that with the Indigenous Summit this past weekend, where we did have a few people coming in from Seattle and Nevada. And so when they crossed the border, they had to show that letter that it was an unpaid showcase. And so therefore they would have no issues in order to cross.
Otherwise, they would have had to go through the normal
That's
process
correct.
that any
Yep.
other US artist would have gone through. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah,
So it goes both ways. That's kind of cool.
it does. Granted, the visa that they need to come in from the US is like $20. It's not
a little
that.
bit different.
Yeah,
Right.
it's called an ETA. But yeah, they just have to fill it out before they do cross.
Okay.
But it's very rare that they're denied it, provided there's no issues with them, of course. But yeah, they don't have to do that if they have that letter crossing over for Indigenous artists.
Got it. Okay. Coming the other direction from Canada into the US, the only problems we've seen about that, well, first of all, the main problem with it is that there isn't actually a law that says that. The law itself is from the 1800s and doesn't actually track current law at all. And what it says is that First Nation Canadians don't need visas to enter the US to work, but neither do any other Canadians, because Canadians don't get visas to enter the US to work. They come in under a visa status, but they don't actually have physical visas. So the way the law reads is it's saying effectively that First Nation Canadians aren't treated any worse than any other Canadians, which is good to know, but not particularly helpful. In application, what we find is that US Customs and Border Protection officers expand on that and just don't require a work authorization at all. For the most part, but it's a little bit dangerous because there are certain officers who don't know or choose to not know. I think it's mostly don't know. And it's usually officers who are working at really small posts, and it's usually the officers who are working in the middle of the night who didn't get the memo, and that's where the problems come from. So if you're a US presenter and you're bringing a Canadian First Nation artist, make sure that they have documentation to explain why they don't need a visa. Encourage them to come to the US to enter the US during business hours on a weekday at a major post, because they're less likely to run a problem with an undereducated officer. And I've also had a situation with a major label that was dealing with a Canadian First Nation artist. And when I started talking like this, they were like, we're not going to risk that. That is just not interesting to us. If there isn't solid law behind this, we're going to get no one visa and be done with this, because we can't afford to risk the possibility of there being an issue. And when there's, in this case, hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line, I understand why it makes sense that they don't want to risk it. But certainly for any artist who's working kind of in the less commercial or independent realm, this is a real boon for Canadian First Nation artists.
I just want to add to that as well,
Yeah.
just because it's so fresh in my mind. With a lot of the Indigenous artists that we presented this last week, coming from different global majority countries, the international ones, and specifically those who were denied, as I mentioned, from Panama. The reason that they were denied is because they said that they didn't have sufficient assets in their countries in order to prove that they would be going back. And so that's another major issue, I would say, especially for Indigenous artists, international, because they might not necessarily own lands the way that we do here. And so that's a completely different way in which that they share territories within each other and don't necessarily have a lease on land that they can say, hey, these are why I have these assets, etc. So I would say that that's another big issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's the same in the US. And you were talking about the presumption, in the US, it's a legal presumption that anyone wanting to come to the US plans to emigrate unless there is reason to think otherwise. That's not just sort of how it seems to work. It's literally written in the law that the officer's job is to start from the presumption that these people plan to remain in the US forever unless they can find a reason to believe otherwise. So if it's an artist from, if it's a very successful artist from Germany, then the presumption is resolved. Like, well, why would you bother? But we've had problems with that, especially when artists coming from war zones. We were really concerned when Ukrainian artists first started coming to the US after the war, because while prior to the war, there would have been no issue about this presumption. As soon as the war started, it was very easy to imagine officers, in a few situations it happened where an officer said, well, obviously you're not going to be going back to the Ukraine. It's a war zone. Why would you do that? So you must be planning to stay. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, we would have issued the visa, but now we have this presumption becomes a problem. Can we pause for questions again? Does anybody have any questions or concerns? We've really been talking a lot about kind of the current state of affairs and issues that we are seeing and in evolving. We've done less of the kind of 101, this is what you need to know about visas. But I also, looking at the people here, I recognize pretty much everybody. And I think you basically, everybody here knows the basic outline of how this process works. But if you have questions that we haven't raised about how the whole process works, please feel free to ask those. Mercedes, you mentioned what I might extrapolate to being just kind of a best practice, that one of the main things to worry about and the main thing to be focused on is just making sure that you know what you're getting into and making sure you're leaving enough time. If you had to give sort of the three main things that you'd want international artists, especially from the US, to know before in preparation for touring in Canada, what would be those three things that are where you see the most mistakes made?
Well, I would say that, ironically enough, just distances. I think a lot of people think that if they get a gig in Vancouver, they'll have one automatically, or they can do one automatically in Toronto, and so they just don't know. So geographically, no, it seems really plain and simple, but it's the truth. Like, I think it's incredible how every single year we say, well, oh, okay, well, I have offers now in London and Toronto and Montreal, and I'm going to do Vancouver. We're like, wait a second, like, hold on, what, like, do you have the funding to do that? Are you getting enough honorarium to do that? And it's that misconception that it's one country and it's okay. And what a lot of people don't know is that we have like 2 airlines in Canada, so they're like constantly raising prices. It's incredibly expensive to travel within Canada compared to pretty much any other country in the world. So it's very, very difficult to move around. So I would say just know geographically where it is that you're going, and make sure as well that you're getting enough dates to cover those costs of the visas themselves once you apply, because again, you're losing that money regardless if you get it. Well, hopefully you're using that money if you get it. But ultimately I would say that, and then ultimately really organize your tour with time. I would say if you're planning a summer tour, for example, just start planning that in November, December. And so that way in January at the latest, you're applying for that visa. We've had bands apply later, and of course that's where we run into problems and run into stress, and then people start dropping out saying, well, if they're not for sure coming, then I'm dropping my offer. And so that's the problem. That's the issue itself. Whereas if people know that they've applied in January, then they're likely going to get it, that unless there's something completely wrong with the system itself, and especially for artists as well. I would also say that if you're doing a conference or some kind of industry related event, if you're applying as an individual, that takes longer than for a band itself to be processed. So just know that, because that takes a little bit more time than the artists themselves, because again, there's a different mindset and priority set, I guess you could say, in terms of having a delegate come for like one event, let's say Canadian Music Week, and then compared to a tour of festivals, which is completely different. So I would say think about those things themselves and just make those connections with those government relations, because that's a big one.
Got it. Maria, you're muted. There we go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. My name is Maria Drell, and I'm with the Brazilian Cultural Center Chicago, and we are applying for a group of artists to come. It's not a band. It's actually a nonprofit organization in Brazil that has a unique kind of talent. The group is called Ileaê, which is an Afro-Brazilian, the first Afro-Brazilian group from Salvador da Bahia. My question is, once we still apply, actually we started with the whole process with them in November. However, it takes time. As you all know, it takes time for them to respond, for translations and everything. So right now we are at the point of filling out the application and putting in the petition through Tamizdat. So basically my question is, they wanted like Mercedes was talking about, now they want Chicago, New York, California. And I said, the dates, we had specific dates. However, what they want to find out is, we are ready to submit the dates. Once they their petitions approved, can they add additional dates when they hear?
In most situations, yes. It would depend a little bit on how the petition is filed, because if the petitioner is the actual employer, then the petition might be structured in a way that doesn't open the possibility for there to be other employers. But in the situation,
give me 1 second.
Yeah. Are you on? You can hear me? Okay. So,
Sorry.
So the chances are that if Tamizdat is acting as your petitioner, then it's being filed with Tamizdat functioning as the petitioning agent, which leaves open the possibility to add other dates. As long as the employment is basically the same, you can add other dates after the petition has been filed. So it shouldn't be a problem. But check with your case manager or your attorney to make sure that the structure of the petition allows that, because you can structure petitions in a lot of different ways, and some are very narrow in what they allow, some are open-ended.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there any questions before we go to Danielle's closing comments? Okay, Danielle, if you had to come up with 3 things that you would recommend.
Very similar to what Mercedes said. Time, for sure. People really don't understand, especially with the US petition process for the work permit, how much time is actually required to gather and sort of review and change all of the documentation required for a petition, and then how that process then actually, sort of gets filed with USCIS, which takes some time before you even get a receipt from them. And that receipt number is then used for actually applying for your in-person consular appointment. So you really have, sort of, if you're looking to do a US tour, 6 months minimum is really when you need to be working on that paperwork and have that done within like just a few weeks time frame. And, because really what you're looking at is probably a good month or so and working on all of that paperwork. And then you're looking at another probably 2 months on top of that to actually get a response from USCIS on that paperwork. And then depending on where you are and at that moment, how long that wait time is for your consular appointment around the world, that could be a couple of weeks, or it could be months or more, depending on where you have to go for that consular appointment. So time is definitely of the essence, and talk with somebody within the country, whether it's Canada or US that you are looking to tour, because they'll be the ones most familiar with what's happening at the moment. And I think just actually to talk about what Maria said briefly about adding dates after the petition, depending on how that petition was filed, that petition has a set of start and end dates associated with it. And as long as you're working with somebody like an agent who's acting as your employer and you've been able to cover that full term, you can add lots of dates at any point. So it really depends on how that is structured, as Matthew said. And then also I would say, network, not only just talking about government connections, as Mercedes said, but also just networking with other agents, networking with other bands, networking with other presenters, just to try to help build a tour that is viable financially, because that is a huge struggle with what it costs for these visas, as well as for the travel. And, just being on the road is very expensive. So it's important to take advantage of those connections and to build those that'll help, each tour become more successful.
Yeah, that all is really good advice. I guess the only things that I would add onto that is to again, underline time, leaving yourself time to do all of this, making sure that you're getting good advice. There's a lot of bad information on the web. There's a lot of bad information that your friends may give you because they think they know what's best, and often they don't. Nothing wrong with your friends, but just some possibility. And I also wanted to say one more thing, Maria, about your question about adding dates. The topic raises a thorny historical issue about what goes on to an itinerary in order to get a visa. And I just want to say that there was a tradition in the performing arts for many years of realizing that you're only going to get a visa in the US as long as the itinerary indicates that you have need for the visa, leading people to fabricate dates and create fake itineraries. This is a terrible idea because it's fraud, and it's submitting fraud to US Homeland Security. And while it might work, we always say it works great until it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, you've just committed fraud, and the artist is going to be screwed. The agent who did it is going to be in scrutiny. It's just, there's a million ways that it's a bad idea. It's especially bad because you really don't need to do it that way. There's plenty of ways to get long-term visas without having to create fraudulent itineraries. But the thing that's tricky about it is this notion that, like, well, you can add dates later, and you can also, you don't actually have to do all the dates on it. So what is a true itinerary? And that's a very nebulous concept, but it comes down to, what are the contracts? What contracts do you have? What is the role of the itinerary in the particular petition you're filing? And is what you're submitting good faith?
Yes.
Good faith also relates to, if Homeland Security gets on the phone and starts calling the venues on the itinerary, what are the people who pick up, when somebody picks up the phone at the other end, what are they going to say about what's on that itinerary?
Okay, and that's what leads to another question, because the situations like this, the Brazilian Cultural Center and the board of directors says we're not going to be responsible for the owner of all the dates. We have agencies in the city. We have several nonprofits that says, oh, you're applying. Okay, next week I have a grant that has been approved, but it's only for the end of September. For us, that doesn't make sense, because they only supposed to be here from the 29th of August until the 6th.
Right.
A manager of the city says, oh, we have the World Music Festival. That's between the 29th until the 1st of October. Can we arrange a date for that? I have no idea how to do that, because everybody now is reaching out, because we're starting, even though we don't have the visa yet, like Mercedes mentioned before, we don't have the visa, but many people already know that we have the intention of bringing them. So right now it's popping up, how you say, different dates, but with lots of holes in the middle.
Sure. Oh, I understand that. So what I would advise to you on that front is, you're in luck, because 2 weeks ago on this very channel, APAP did a session on the strategies for getting long-term visas for international artists. And I don't know, Krista or Willie, I don't know if that webinar has been posted yet for public consumption, but go back to that, because in your situation, Maria, what you want to do is just get a long-term visa that covers this and potential dates that could be happening in the future. If it's a P, you want to get that full year. If it's an O, ideally go for the full 3 years. Learn the strategies for how to do that, so that you're not wasting money on getting multiple petitions. And then the artist is set up so that if those dates come in down the pike, because the first dates are successful, people get excited about them, then they already have the visa in place. So go back and watch that video.
Okay, and yeah, they're already excited. Just the notion of bringing this group, they haven't been here for 20 years.
Yeah.
Everybody's already excited about it.
Okay,
So we are getting a lot of calls. Can we put us? Can we set a date? Can we do this? Can we that? Do
Sure.
we need a contract in hand to do that?
Right. And you
Okay.
don't, you do and you don't, but there's a lot of ways. But that was the
Okay,
last.
I'll talk to
So
my
go back to
manager.
that. Yeah, go
Okay,
back to
thank
that
you.
last webinar. So I think we're a little ahead of time. We got a little bit of time left. So if there's other questions, we can certainly take them. But otherwise, that kind of covers the primary topics that we came here to talk about. Unless Mercedes or Danielle, you have anything else you want to add? Okay, that's pretty easy. Thank you all. Thank you, Willie. Thank you, Krista, for giving this opportunity. Mercedes and Danielle, thank you so much for joining me and all your vast wisdom that you rained upon us. That was wonderful. Thank you, Boo, for keeping all of this stuff organized. Really appreciate that. And thank you to the audience folks who came.
Awesome.
I hope this was useful for everybody.
Thank you so much, panel, Matthew, Boo from Tamizdat, Danielle, Mercedes, our ASL interpreters, and Willie Santiago from our team to making this so successful. Really appreciate all that you shared. I think that we have a quick survey that we can put into the chat. There we go. The Tamizdat session that you mentioned, Matthew, hasn't been posted yet, but it will be posted this week. So was it Maria? Yeah, Maria, check on our website under programs, and that should be there in the next day or so. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Make sure you come next week.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kristen.
Take care. Bye-bye.